So the second component of our stakeholder outreach were the 2 series of stakeholder focus groups. The first one was a set of focus groups. The second one was more of a workshop working session that we held with various stakeholder agencies. And these allowed us to really dig deeper and have conversations about these issues, talk about what tools work, what doesn't, and what the people, with the folks who are the most familiar with the local landscape. The first round of these, which was way back in 2013, involved about 70 participants that represented DOTD, MPOs, municipal and parish planning, and public works departments, some advocacy organizations, as well as private firms, chambers of commerce, and a couple of elected officials all showed up. So we asked the participants to talk about their jurisdiction's needs and priorities, about which of the tools in the toolbox for growth management were going to be the most useful, were the most feasible, which ones they didn't even want to consider, and about issues that were specific to their region as well as statewide issues. And we found that there are definitely efforts underway to coordinate transportation infrastructure and land use planning more closely. And we found that DOTD's access management and complete streets policies have been impacting local policy to varying degrees, but there's still an overall sort of lack of coordination that has been stymieing these efforts, as well as a strong resistance to any sort of regulatory intervention in parts of the state, which does result in some tensions between rural and urbanized areas where there's a lot of growth. And we found finally that funding and staff capacity are ubiquitous constraints when it comes to implementing these new policies or tools. So from there, we took all of the information that was gleaned from these focus groups and from the survey as well, and we developed this list of 23 recommended growth management policies, strategies, and general ideas to promote local growth management. And these guidelines then formed the basis of the discussion that we had at the second round of meetings around the state, where we went talked to 45 stakeholders this time, slightly smaller group, but very much in detail. We talked about these guidelines. We had them go through one by one and had discussed their thoughts about them to develop a consensus about what were the top priorities was the biggest concern, which were the ones that were the most important for the state, as well as separately with the ones that were for the region. Talk about what were the actions that would need to happen in order to implement any of these, as well as who were the stakeholders who would need to be involved to advance them, and relatively speaking, how challenging they would be, whether due to cost or political climate or any other number of impediments. So in the end, we were able to identify 9 of the 23 strategies, and we reduced the total number of 23. It got down to 20 eventually. We reduced it down to 9 strategies, and I'm not going to go over this list in detail because we're going to come back to that, circle around. But these were the lists that we came out from the group consensus building exercises that we did about these were the things we needed to focus on for the state. And with that, I'll bring it back to John to get back into the modeling exercises that we worked on.
But one of the tasks that we were charged with was to take a look at modeling the potential implementation impacts of growth management in Louisiana. And in order to do that, what we did was we hired a colleague of mine, Professor Reed Ewing, who's now at the University of Utah. He wrote the best-selling American Planning Association published book of all times called Best Development Practices, and he's one of the most prolific urban transportation planning scholars. And we hired him to help guide the modeling portion of this project. The purpose is to evaluate the relationships between the built environment and transportation variables with vehicle miles traveled and safety indicators at the metropolitan level. And we were able to collect data in the metropolitan regions of New Orleans and Baton Rouge only. The other metropolitan regions in the state didn't have the level of detail that we needed to fully complete this exercise, so we just looked at the 2 metropolitan regions. The methodology was that Dr. Ewing developed a nationwide study using dozens of metropolitan regions across the country and developed elasticity models that look at how vehicle miles traveled in urbanized areas vary based on a number of indicators, including economic and demographic variables, and then predicting change in crash rates based on these VMTs and built environment variables. And this will become a little bit more understandable when I get into the charts on the next few slides. And then the output that we created is, in essence, an editable worksheet that anybody could use that can be populated with the latest data that we've collected. Could be updated, of course, as time goes forward. But it shows how changes in the built environment, you know, which could result from a policy change, could result in changes in VMTs and traffic safety outcomes. So what we did was we collected these data sources here, population, income, fuel price, freeway lane miles, other lane miles, population densities, transit passenger miles per capita, employment densities, intersection densities, crash rates, injury rates, percentage of four-way intersections, and fatality rates per 100,000 people in both metropolitan regions. And we were able, based on his national studies of many, many, many cities across the country, able to collect these data here in these two regions and to look at how future changes in these variables would change VMTs and traffic safety outcomes. So for example, we have a baseline, and the baseline, I can't remember if this is the New Orleans or, oh, Baton Rouge. This is the Baton Rouge model looking at where things would be by the year 2030. The baseline now, or 2010, is that there's 9,319 annual VMTs per capita. And there's a crash rate of 2,613 per 100,000 people, an injury rate of 668 per 100,000 people, and a fatality rate of 5.89 per 100,000 people. So we decided that we needed to create a low growth scenario, a base growth scenario, and a high growth scenario. And these were simply, you know, looking at the literature, looking at what we thought made sense, basically an educated guess, but we didn't want to just pick one guess for the future, so we did a low growth, a base growth, and a high growth, or base growth could be replaced with the word medium growth. And we basically said that VMTs will grow from 4% in the low scenario to as much as 18% in the high scenario. And crash rates, you know, so these are the outcomes of looking at the different kind of scenarios of the changes in the built environment. Here you could see the ones for the New Orleans. It'll become a little bit more clearly as I actually don't think I have the spreadsheet in here that shows it. So what we did was, for each one of these variables, we estimated what we thought made sense in terms of growth, okay, in terms of population growth, in terms of fuel price growth, you know, between now and 2030, employment density, and then based on those different levels of growth scenarios, these are the outcomes here. So what I'm not showing you is the slide of what the growth rates are, right? Because it would be a very detailed slide. It's in the report, which will be posted on the LTRC website here pretty soon. But basically what we're showing is that we can grow in Baton Rouge based on these different growth trends, 4% to 18% VMTs. The New Orleans could grow from 5% to 21%. And the fatality rates, the injury rates, and the crash rates, they're all pretty much highly correlated with the growth in VMTs. So what we decided to do next was we did this thing called a backcasting model. Now, we all know what forecasting is, right? Forecasting is what we did. We said, we think population growth will grow by X%. We think employment will grow by Y%. We think transit, you know, utilization may stay the same or may grow. And then we look at what those growth rates how that impacts VMTs and fatality and injury rates, and that gives us a number for the future. Well, backcasting does the opposite. Backcasting is developed out, it's really been developed heavily from David Bannister, who's a professor at Oxford and one of the more prolific scholars in sustainable transportation, basically said, okay, look, if we have a goal in the future, what would we need to change along the way to achieve that goal? And so, for example, if we wanted to cap VMT growth, right? So a lot of talk about carbon dioxide emissions, for example, says we need to cap or reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Well, how do we do that if we have growing VMTs, right? So then the question is, well, how do we cap VMT growth? Or not even cap the growth, how do we cap the absolute level of VMTs? Or how do we cap the level of traffic injuries or fatalities or crashes? We don't want to see growth in traffic injuries. So we took a point in the future and we said, okay, how do we change these different built environment prices or fuel prices or population densities? And this is where Reed Ewing's work gets to us, because he has the estimates at the national model for the elasticities. So we know if we increase fuel prices significantly, VMTs are going to go down, because if it costs $10 to buy a gallon of gas, people are going to not drive as much. Population density has the same relationship. The higher the population density becomes in a metropolitan region, the more opportunities there are for transit or alternative transportation options, and people drive fewer. So we took a look at the New Orleans and the Baton Rouge metropolitan areas, and we applied these backcasting targets. And again, we did the same sort of thing where we had like kind of a low growth, a base growth, and a high growth. And in the low growth scenarios, we said, okay, well, we don't want to say the best way to reduce VMTs or to cap VMTs is that nobody ever moves to Louisiana, right, or to New Orleans and Baton Rouge. That wouldn't make sense, right? We still want to see population growth. We still want to see growth in income per capita. We expect that there will be growth in fuel prices, and we used data from the Energy Information Association or the Department of, I forget, there's a department, federal department, that predicts future prices in energy, which is always a crystal ball. But we tried to predict what future fuel prices would be based on past trends over the last several decades. We decided that there will be some growth in freeway lane miles and other roadway lane miles, but it's probably not going to be significant. But we accounted for a low growth rate of 1.5% up to a high growth rate of 6% on a per capita basis. Population density, that's the lever that we need to play with, right, in order to make sure that VMT growth is not increasing, or that injury fatality rates remain capped, right? So that was the numbers that we came up with there that allowed us to be able to cap VMTs. Same with transit passenger miles, growth employment densities. I'm not going to kind of get into all of the nitty-gritty details in this, but the interesting thing is to say, well, shoot, we're seeing a 92% growth in population density in the Baton Rouge area by 2030. That doesn't sound right to me, right? Well, actually, it really is not as far-fetched as you may think, because what we found is that the population densities that Baton Rouge would need to achieve, right, even in the highest of the scenarios, is actually lower than the population density of the New Orleans metropolitan region is today. So what that's saying is the Baton Rouge metropolitan area is a fairly low density type of an environment, and promoting infill development in the region of Baton Rouge can be quite significant with population growth without having to spill over and develop new lands in greenfields. And if you account for all that population growth, you can actually then still see a built environment footprint that is really no different than the New Orleans region. And the New Orleans region, again, if we were to grow our population densities in this region, which is happening, and we're seeing massive growth in the city of New Orleans population, all of that is leading to a much higher rate of population density. The other thing with transit is that, again, with the Baton Rouge transit service, the model shows that the levels of transit service that need to be achieved in the Baton Rouge in 2030 are about the same types of transit service levels that are already in the New Orleans metropolitan region today. And then when you look at the projections in the New Orleans area, the backcasting model, we find that our target is certainly much more aligned with other cities like Charlotte and places that are Denver and Washington, D.C., places that are moving more towards a model of infill development, having more compact communities. Because even New Orleans, the city itself is fairly dense, and even the Jefferson Parish is relatively dense. But if you go into the West Bank, there's a lot of room, I think, for infill development on the South Shore. Our model didn't include the North Shore. I believe it was just the South Shore, our model for the New Orleans region. So the next step, a completely new set of analyses we did was a return on investment analysis. And in this study, what we did was we based this on the Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Report. And I know the guys that produced the Urban Mobility Report. That's the most cited transportation document ever. I mean, when that report comes out each year, it's cited in every news publication in the United States. That's the one that says, the average American sits in traffic for, 40 hours a year, and the average person in Los Angeles sits in traffic for 90 hours a year. And we worked with the authors of that report to help guide what we could do to look at this return on analysis investment. The purpose of this little analysis was to evaluate the costs and potential benefits of access management principles, which is a key transportation-based growth management strategy. What we did was we took the TTI Urban Mobility Report data, we looked at the Baton Rouge and the New Orleans regions, we extrapolated the hours of delay and the costs associated that could be avoided with having full access management implementation for all of our arterials, and we took some cost estimates that were provided by DOTD to figure out what would it cost to put in access management on all of the arterials and what would the return on that investment be. And what we were able to develop is a evaluation of the potential impact of access management on arterial network over a 5-year period compared to cost per mile retrofits. So what we found in the Baton Rouge area is that currently 25% of the arterial network has access management features. If we had gone back from 2007 to 2011, which is the latest years that we had data available for, and we said that what would have been the impact if 100% of those arterials had access management features. It would save 5.7 million hours of delay, which represents cost savings of $141 million. And this is based on the TTI methodologies. And you can see we also calculated for 50% coverage, 75% coverage. We could calculate any level of coverage up to 100%. And in the New Orleans area, we found that in 2011, there were 53% of the arterials had access management coverage. And because a larger percentage of them compared to the 25% in Baton Rouge, there were smaller foregone benefits compared to Baton Rouge. So only 2.7 million hours of delay would have been saved if we had 100% coverage, and $60.6 million in cost savings in delay over the 5 years. Now, what we found is that on the cost side of what it would take to actually implement access management across these arterial networks is that the costs vary considerably, and it was difficult for us to actually know what the actual cost would be. For example, to estimate the cost on a per mile basis, we use a calculation of major and minor intersection densities on typical arterial corridors. In New Orleans, for example, we use Elysian Fields Avenue and West Esplanade Avenue, and in Baton Rouge, we use Government Street and Bluebonnet Boulevard. The estimated costs were between $2.3 million and $4.8 million per mile in New Orleans, and about $1.7 to $4.9 million in Baton Rouge. So you can see pretty large deltas between the low end and the high end. But even with that said, we found, and this right here is an example of all the different types of traffic calming features that go into creating an access management application. So what we found is that the estimated total cost of implementing access management throughout New Orleans and Baton Rouge, we had 1,457 lane miles in Baton Rouge. 25% of them already had access management, so that meant that about 1,093 did not. So on the low side, it's 1.7 to 4.9 million per mile. That translates to $1.8 billion to $5.3 billion to actually, did I get the numbers right? I think so. Very, very expensive to go in and actually create access management on 100% of our arterials. While it's a good thing to do from a traffic standpoint, it's not cheap to do. So what we found is that the benefits of doing that, of say somewhere between 11 to 14 million dollars per year of expanding that alone, okay, from the benefit side, is insufficient to justify the cost of this comprehensive retrofitting approach. Additionally, there are non-quantifiable benefits, for example, safety, reduction in fatalities and crashes, environmental benefits, economic development benefits. Those aren't necessarily captured in the direct costs and the benefits. But in the findings, we noticed that incorporating access management principles strategically along corridors where they're most benefit users and surrounding communities, that should happen, right? It doesn't make sense to spend all the money to do it everywhere, but strategically target where it should be. And then also seek land use-based solutions to reduce auto congestion and promoting non-automobile travel opportunities for a greater impact and return on investment.